Hi, welcome to True Crime Echoes, where we tell the stories that continue to reverberate long after the headlines fade. I'm glad you're here because today's case isn't just disturbing, it's haunting. It's the kind of story that makes you question how far fantasy can go when it's fed by trauma and ignored by everyone else. It's a story about a group of teenagers who believed they were part of something larger than life, a vampire clan, a sacred mission, a chosen family. But behind the Gothic rituals and blood-soaked mythology was something far more terrifying. Real violence, real victims, and the kind of damage that no one walks away from unchanged. This is the story of Rod Ferrell and the Vampire Clan murders. Let's begin. Chapter 1. Something about vampires. Hi. I want to start this off with something simple, just a hello. I don't know where you are right now or what kind of day you've had, but I'm really glad you're here with me. Because today's story, it's one of those that doesn't just disturb you. It lingers. And if you're anything like me, it'll leave you asking why. Over and over. I've told a lot of stories about darkness, about people who break, people who harm. But there's something about this one that feels different. Because it doesn't start in the shadows, it starts in imagination. Fantasy, games, stories about vampires. That's what caught my attention. When you hear the word vampire, what comes to mind? Fangs, blood, maybe a black cape turning into a bat, or sparkling skin if you were raised on Twilight. We've seen vampires portrayed as seductive, tragic, immortal, but in the end, it's just fantasy. Right. Not for everyone. Some people don't just like vampires, they live like them. They believe they are them. And that's where our story begins. With a boy who wanted to be more than human, who found a sense of identity, power, and purpose in the vampire mythos. A boy who didn't just blur the line between fantasy and reality, he shattered it completely. His name is Rod Ferrell, but that's not what he called himself. No, to him, he was Vesago, a 500-year-old vampire with a mission. And what started as a game, some twisted blend of roleplay and rebellion, ended in the brutal murder of two people, two real people. Parents, humans, not characters in a story, not symbols in some gothic fairy tale, just a mom and dad trying to live their lives in a quiet Florida suburb. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This case, what became infamously known as the Vampire Clan murders, isn't just about blood or ritual. It's about the way trauma shapes people, the way neglect, abuse, and instability can push a person to invent an entire world just to feel safe, just to feel seen. It's about how hurt kids sometimes find each other, and instead of healing, they feed each other's chaos. I've thought about Rod Ferrell a lot. About his childhood, about his mother, about the people he surrounded himself with. And the truth is, I don't think he started out evil. I think he started out broken. And the world gave him no tools to fix himself. Now that doesn't excuse what he did. Not even close. But it helps explain it. And sometimes understanding why someone did something awful is the only way we can make sense of senseless things. So, this is not a story about monsters with fangs and cloaks. This is a story about people. About wounds passed down from one generation to the next. About young minds lost in fantasy reaching for control in a life that felt completely out of their hands. And how all of that led to murder. If you're still here, thank you. Just know this story contains heavy themes, child abuse, trauma, blood, and violence. If any of that is too much for you, please take care of yourself and step away. There will always be another story. But if you're ready, let's begin. Let me tell you what really happened with Rod Ferrell, the boy who believed he was a vampire, and the night he made that fantasy a reality. Chapter 2. Born in the Dark. Before Rod Ferrell called himself a vampire, before the rituals, before the blood, he was just a little boy. He was born on March 28, 1980 in Kentucky. His mother Sandra was only 17 when she had him. Still a teenager herself, just a kid, really. And his father Rick wasn't any older. Two teenagers playing house, trying to raise a baby they were far from ready for. 9 days after Rod was born, they got married. Maybe out of love, or maybe because they felt like they had to because of tradition pressure, fear of shame. It's not really clear. But what is clear is that the marriage fell apart almost instantly. Just a few weeks in, they separated. Rick enlisted in the military and walked away from the family, just like that. So Rod was left with his mother, Sandra, 17, alone, no income, no support, no stable future. She did what a lot of young single moms would do. She moved back in with her parents, back home to Murray, Kentucky. It's a small town, quiet, with maybe 17,000 people back then. One of those places with a college, a couple parks, some old theaters. The kind of place where people know your name and your secrets. From the outside, it probably looked like Sandra was doing her best. But behind closed doors, things were far from safe. Rod wasn't even 5 years old when he was first abused. Not by a stranger, not by someone far removed from the family. No, it was his grandfather. His own grandfather. And according to reports, it happened during a fishing trip when Rod was supposed to be bonding, learning how to cast a line or bait a hook. Instead, he was violated. But what makes this even more horrifying is that it wasn't the first time that man had done it. Rod's grandfather had a history of abuse. He'd assaulted Sandra when she was a child, and another one of his daughters, too. Abuse was generational in that household. Hidden, normalized, passed down like a curse. When Sandra found out what had happened to her son, she did something brave. She confronted her father. We don't know exactly what was said. There are no records of a formal report, no details about consequences. But we do know that Rod would later say that confrontation, the moment when everything came out, was just as traumatizing as the abuse itself. Imagine that. The pain of what happened, multiplied by the chaos of being exposed, of having the adults around you, yelling, fighting, denying, blaming. And that was Rod's childhood. That was the environment he grew up in. After that, Sandra and Rod bounced around a lot. They lived in public housing, moved between states, never really putting down roots. There was no stability, and when Sandra remarried and moved to Michigan, her new husband made it clear he didn't want Rod, so they left him, with the grandparents. Again, according to Rod, the man looked him in the eyes and said, "We're never coming back." Can you imagine hearing that, being a child, already abused, already abandoned by one father, and now hearing it again? Different voice, same message, you're not wanted. Eventually, Sandra did come back. She divorced the man who tried to exile her son, and she moved in again with her parents. But the damage was done. By this point, Rod had been uprooted, discarded, and abused multiple times. And Sandra, she wasn't unscathed either. She had lived her own version of hell. A teenage mother, a survivor of incest, a woman who, instead of healing, had buried everything under layers of escapism. And maybe that's why what happened next makes a strange kind of sense. She needed an escape, something to distract her from everything she'd been through, something to give her back a sense of control. And in the late 80s or early 90s, she found it. It wasn't drugs or alcohol. Not yet anyway. It was a game. A tabletop role-playing game called Vampire the Masquerade. I know it sounds harmless, fictional, fantasy. But for Sandra and Rod, it became something more, something deeper, something that blurred the line between imagination and identity. And that's where the transformation really began. But we'll get into that next. Because for now, what I want you to understand is, this Rod Ferrell wasn't born a monster. He was born in pain. And when children grow up in the dark, they don't always learn how to reach for the light. Sometimes, they reach for blood instead. Chapter 3. The game was never just a game. There's something about childhood pain that makes people hungry for fantasy. And I don't say that with judgment, because when the real world is cold, cruel, and unstable, fantasy becomes a kind of survival. It's a place where you make the rules, where you're not a victim, where you have power. For Sandra and her son Rod, that escape came in the form of a game, a tabletop role-playing game called Vampire the Masquerade. Now, if you're not familiar with it, let me explain. Think of it as Dungeons and Dragons, but with vampires. Instead of fighting dragons in caves, you're embodying supernatural beings who live in the shadows of human society. It's dark gothic, heavy with lore. There are bloodlines, clans, magical powers, political rivalries, this whole intricate universe that players can disappear into. And for Sandra, this was it. This was the escape hatch. She became obsessed. And soon she brought Rod into it too. He was still a teenager already, withdrawn, already angry. And here was a game that didn't just let him escape, it made him powerful. It didn't take long before Rod had fully stepped into his character. He called himself Vesago, a 500-year-old vampire. He wasn't just playing anymore, he believed it. And I think that was the point. In this vampire identity, Rod wasn't the kid who got left behind or the boy whose body had been used and discarded. He was ancient, wise, dangerous, untouchable. What started as a game became a lifestyle. Rod began dressing the part, long black trench coats, dark clothes, heavy boots. He grew his hair out, tied it back, leaned hard into the gothic aesthetic. His bedroom transformed into a shrine to darkness, upside-down crosses, satanic texts, broken glass in the corner of the room for reasons no one ever fully understood. There were photos of himself hanging upside down like a bat. Hooks and cables dangling from the ceiling. It was theatrical, yes, but it was also deeply symbolic. A kid trying to turn his pain into power, trying to control the narrative of who he was. He started reading vampire literature, especially Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles. The lines between Vesago and Rod blurred more and more, and in that blurring, something dangerous began to grow. Because when fantasy becomes more real than reality, you stop recognizing consequences. And here's where it gets darker. Rod wasn't playing alone. He started meeting other teens who felt like outsiders too. Kids who had been neglected, abused, or just didn't belong. Misfits. And he welcomed them in. Not just as friends, but as clan members, followers. He found Stephen first a boy who was equally obsessed with vampires, the occult, and the promise of something greater than ordinary life. Together, they performed a ritual at a tombstone they called the birthplace. They cut their arms, drank each other's blood. Rod was officially turned. It sounds ridiculous, I know, but when you're young, broken, and desperate to belong, these things become sacred. Dangerous, but sacred. What's more disturbing is that Sandra didn't just tolerate this behavior. She encouraged it. She took on the name Sta, Mistress of the Dark. She dressed in black lace, turned their home into a gothic lair. She leaned into the theatrics, into the vampire mythology, as if it were something romantic instead of tragic. There was a night she walked in on Rod and his friends in his room cutting themselves. There was blood on the floor. And her reaction: boys will be boys. Just clean up after yourselves. That still haunts me. Because instead of intervening, instead of pulling her son back from the edge, she handed him more rope. She wasn't a parent in that moment, she was a co-conspirator. And maybe part of her believed the fantasy too. After all, if your real life has been nothing but violence and shame, why wouldn't you want to believe in something else? Something eternal, something powerful, something that couldn't be touched. But what none of them seemed to realize was that the more they fed this identity, the more Rod disconnected from reality. He wasn't just playing a role. He was becoming someone else. Someone colder, more impulsive, more dangerous. The boy named Rod was fading, and Vesago was waking up. Chapter 4. The Clan of the Damned. It's strange, isn't it? How loneliness finds company. Rod wasn't alone for long. As his obsession with vampirism deepened, so did his need to be seen, not just as a character in a game, but as someone larger than life, someone other people would listen to, follow. And slowly, that began to happen. He started to attract people, teenagers mostly, outsiders. The kinds of kids who always sat in the back of class, who didn't have safe homes or stable families, who felt like freaks in a world that didn't want them. To them, Rod didn't seem dangerous. He seemed like a leader, like someone who got it, because he did. He knew what it felt like to be rejected, abandoned, abused. And instead of burying that pain, he wore it like a badge. He turned it into mythology, and he invited others to do the same. That's how the vampire clan was born. Stephen was gone by now. Their friendship had fallen apart after a violent fight and some even darker allegations involving Rod's mother. But Rod didn't need Stephen anymore. He was building something of his own. One of the first to join was a boy named Howard Anderson. He was just 16. Like Rod, Howard came from a deeply troubled home. His father was reportedly an alcoholic who abused his mother. Howard had seen things no child should ever witness. So when he met Rod, someone who seemed to understand that kind of pain, he gravitated toward him instantly. Howard didn't just want a friend, he wanted belonging. And Rod gave him that, told him he was special, made him feel chosen. There were others too. Dana Cooper and Charity Kesey. Charity became Rod's girlfriend. She was quiet, withdrawn, described by people around her as sweet but isolated. Dana, on the other hand, was louder, older. Her family said she was strange, craved attention, but was easy to manipulate. Some people even claimed Dana was the real leader of the group, but everything that followed says otherwise. Because when you looked at the group dynamics, it was always Rod at the center. Always. He wasn't just their friend. He was their lord, their vampire king, and they referred to him as such. They gave themselves names, roles, hierarchies, and as ridiculous as it might sound, this mattered to them. It gave them identity, purpose. In a world that had told them they were worthless, this was their way of taking some power back. The group started hanging out in this place they called the Vampire Hotel. It wasn't actually a hotel, it was just a rundown building in the woods near Kentucky Lake. But to them, it was a sanctuary, a hideout, a temple. They threw parties there, did drugs, played out rituals. The lines between real life and fantasy continued to blur. And the drugs. They changed everything. At first it was weed, then LSD. Then it escalated to harder substances, cocaine, heroin, and with the drugs came something darker, mood swings, hallucinations, violent outbursts. Rod became unpredictable. One moment he was thoughtful, brooding. The next he was smashing furniture, screaming at the sky, claiming to be possessed by a demon. He'd go days without sleeping. He said the voices in his head were guiding him. And the others, his so-called clan, they followed him still. There was one story from October 1996 that still makes my stomach turn. Rod and some of the others reportedly broke into a local animal shelter. They killed animals, for ritual, for power, for whatever twisted belief they were trying to prove. Rod was arrested and charged with animal cruelty, but somehow he didn't end up behind bars for long. And I can't help but think if someone had stopped him, then if someone had really seen how far gone he was, could it have prevented what came next? Because the next part of the story isn't just disturbing, it's irreversible. What started as a game was about to become a murder. Chapter 5. The Girl Who Lit the Match. If you've ever been a teenager and felt like no one understood you, you'll probably relate to this next part, at least on some human level. Because sometimes all it takes is one person to make you feel like your weirdness makes sense, that your pain is seen, that you're not crazy, you're just different. And for Rod, that person was Heather Wendorf. Heather was 15 when she met Rod. He was living in Eustis, Florida for a while, bouncing around as usual, and somehow their paths crossed. People who knew her back then described her as bright, sweet, normal, until she met Rod. And after that, everything changed. She started wearing all black dyed, her hair purple, became withdrawn. Her friends said she barely spoke. Her family, especially her parents, felt like she had become someone else entirely. Like a fog had crept in and swallowed their daughter whole. But for Heather, I imagine Rod must have felt like a lighthouse. He was intense, mysterious, a little dangerous. He talked about being a vampire, about escaping the rules of society, about belonging to something greater. And when you're young and confused and desperate to feel powerful in your own skin, that can be intoxicating. They stayed in touch even after Rod moved back to Kentucky. Phone calls, letters, constant connection. And this wasn't the era of texting or FaceTime. Every long-distance call cost money. Rod ran up an $850 phone bill just to keep hearing her voice. That's how deep he was. And here's where things take a turn. One night, during one of those long calls, Heather told Rod that her parents were abusing her. We don't know if that's true. To this day, there's no confirmed evidence that Richard and Naomi Wendorf harmed their daughter. But in Rod's mind, it didn't matter. That one sentence, "they're hurting me," was enough to unlock something violent inside him. Something protective. Or maybe vengeful. Maybe it reminded him of his own childhood, his own helplessness. Maybe for the first time he saw himself as someone who could stop the cycle. So he made a decision. He was going to rescue Heather. Now Rod had already been planning a trip to New Orleans with his vampire clan. There was a video arcade there. He wanted to visit something that sounds almost innocent in the context of everything else. But that trip turned into something more, something darker. He told his clan they'd make a quick stop in Florida to pick up Heather. Just a detour, he said. Except if you look at a map, you'll realize that's not really how detours work. Kentucky to New Orleans does not pass through Florida. But again, logic wasn't driving this car. Fantasy was. On the night of November 23, 1996, Rod, his girlfriend Charity Howard, and Dana piled into an old Buick Skyhawk and began their 750-mile drive to Eustis, Florida. The road trip itself was chaotic from the beginning. They got a flat tire, got pulled over by police. Rod was high on LSD the entire time. They were teenagers barely functioning with zero plan and too much rage in their veins. And yet somehow they made it. They met up with Heather, who welcomed them with open arms. And in the early hours of November 26th, they drove together to a nearby cemetery, because of course they did. That's where Rod performed his official vampire ritual, turning Heather into one of them, a full member of the clan. Heather was now his vampire bride, his rescued soul. And then came the second part of the plan. Rod told the group they needed a new car. He was paranoid, convinced the cops were on their trail after being stopped earlier. Heather mentioned that her family had a Ford Explorer in the garage. It would be easy, she said. Just slip in, grab the keys, and go. That was the story anyway. But Rod wasn't thinking about escape anymore. He was thinking about justice, or revenge, or some twisted version of love. And that's what scares me most about this story. It's not just about evil or cruelty. It's about how pain, when it goes untreated, can turn into obsession, how fantasy can fester in silence, how a single sentence, "they're hurting me," can spiral into something irreversible. That night, Rod Ferrell stepped into that house not just as Vesago the vampire, but as judge, jury, and executioner. And nothing would ever be the same again. Chapter 6. Blood on the Threshold. It was never supposed to happen like that. At least that's what some of them would later say. That the plan was simple: sneak into the house, take the keys, and leave. No violence, no confrontation, just grab the car and go. But when you give a disturbed, drugged-up teenager a sense of divine purpose and a crowbar, you're not going to get clean exits. You're going to get blood. Rod and Howard were the ones who went in. Heather had told them exactly what to do. She'd leave the garage door unlocked. Her parents would be asleep. Just get the keys to the Explorer and disappear into the night. No one had to get hurt. But that's not how it went. The house was quiet when they entered. Ordinary suburban, almost too normal for what was about to happen inside. Rod, high on LSD and fully immersed in his vampire delusion, started looking for the car keys. They weren't in plain sight. That's when he found the crowbar, and something in him snapped. Heather's father, Richard, was asleep on the couch, vulnerable, unaware, human. And in that moment, Rod wasn't just a thief. He wasn't just a teenage boy. In his mind, he was Vesago, a 500-year-old vampire, a protector, a punisher. And Richard, whether he deserved it or not, became the enemy. Rod raised the crowbar and brought it down, again and again and again, until Richard's skull fractured, until his ribs gave way, until his body stopped moving. Rod later said it took almost 20 minutes for him to die. That detail still makes me sick. Meanwhile, Naomi Heather's mother was in the shower. She had no idea her husband was bleeding out just a few rooms away. No idea that her daughter had led monsters into their home. She stepped out, wrapped herself in a towel, went into the kitchen to make coffee. Just a normal moment in what was about to become the last minutes of her life. She saw Rod covered in blood crowbar, still in hand, and for a second, maybe she didn't even understand what she was looking at. Maybe her brain couldn't process it fast enough. But then instinct kicked in. She threw the hot coffee at him, tried to run, but Rod was faster and angrier. He chased her down and beat her to death, just like he had done to her husband. No mercy, no hesitation, just rage, and maybe some twisted sense of ritual. Because after both parents were dead, Rod and Howard didn't leave right away. They searched the bodies, took the car keys from Richard's pocket, grabbed jewelry, credit cards, anything they could pawn to fund their trip. And then they did something even more chilling. They performed a kind of ritual over the bodies. Rod claimed it was sacred, that it was symbolic. He burned a V into Richard's chest, the mark of Vesago, his vampire signature, his calling card. Imagine being that far gone, that deep in your delusion, that you mark your victim like a piece of property. And Heather, she wasn't there. She was down the street supposedly saying goodbye to her boyfriend. That's what she told the others. That's what she told the police. That she didn't know what was happening inside her own house, but her sister would be the one to discover the bodies, the one to walk into that kitchen, the one to carry the weight of that night for the rest of her life. That still haunts me, because Heather's sister wasn't part of any game. She didn't wear black or read vampire novels or drink blood. She was just a teenage girl coming home and finding her parents dead on the floor. And Rod, he didn't feel regret. Not then. They took the Ford Explorer, met back up, with the girls swapped license plates between the stolen car and the old one, and hit the road again, destination New Orleans. Because even after 2 murders, in their minds, the game wasn't over. They still thought they were free. Chapter 7. The Road to Nowhere. It's strange how easily some people think they can outrun reality. After the murders, you'd think there would have been panic, some kind of moment where it all hit them. But no. Rod and the rest of the so-called vampire clan acted like they were just continuing the trip. As if nothing had changed, as if killing 2 people was just a brief detour. They left the Wendorf house with stolen credit cards, jewelry, and the family's Ford Explorer. They had the old Buick too, so now they had 2 cars, and a plan if you can call it that. They drove to the nearby town of Sanford, Florida, where they switched the license plates on both vehicles to avoid being traced. That was the big idea: blend in, disappear, and head to New Orleans just like they originally planned. Back to the fantasy, back to the game, only now they were fugitives. They passed through Tallahassee, kept heading west, and ended up in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, just days after the murders. It was Thanksgiving Day. They were tired, hungry, and running low on cash. The group was fraying, the adrenaline was wearing off, and the road wasn't as thrilling anymore. Reality, slowly but surely, was catching up to them. That's when Charity, Rod's girlfriend, decided to call her grandmother in South Dakota. She asked her for money, said they were stranded and needed help. Nothing about the murders. Nothing about the blood still fresh in their memories. Just kids looking for a handout. But her grandmother wasn't stupid. She agreed to wire them the money, told Charity to go to the Howard Johnson Hotel nearby and wait for it to arrive. What they didn't know is that after she hung up, she called the police. She just had a feeling, and honestly, I think that's what helped crack this case open. That one phone call, that one gut instinct. Because by the time the group got to the hotel, the police were already waiting for them. They were arrested without a fight. 5 teenagers, high, sleep-deprived, scared. One of them was Heather. She didn't say much. The others were shaken. But Rod, he didn't resist. He didn't cry. He didn't beg. He confessed. Twice. In his first statement, Rod said, "And I'll never forget this, I went to her dad and smacked the fuck out of him until he finally quit breathing. So yes, I'm admitting to murder. Actually, it took him about 20 fucking minutes to stop. I swear I thought he was immortal or something. That wasn't remorse. That was mockery. He thought he was clever, or maybe he still believed he was Vesago, that the rules didn't apply to him, that killing was just part of the role. When they asked him if he felt sorry, he said no. He said, "Killing is a way of life." I think about that a lot, that sentence, because it says everything about where his head was. This wasn't just a moment of rage. This was a mindset one that had been building for years. But Howard, he told a different story. He said it was premeditated, that they had talked about killing the Wendorfs, that even though Heather begged them not to, Rod had made up his mind. Howard admitted he was going to go after the father while Rod would take care of the mother. But when the moment came, Rod did it all. Howard just watched. Whether you believe that or not, it's clear no one in that house was innocent. And back in Florida, the police were already connecting the dots. Heather's sister had discovered the bodies. The house was a crime scene. There were bloodstains, signs of forced entry, and one very disturbing detail, the letter Heather left behind. It said she was running away, that she loved her parents, that she was sorry. It read like a goodbye note, but it also looked like a breadcrumb trail, like a clue. And it worked, because within days, the entire vampire clan was sitting in jail. The fantasy had ended. The costumes, the rituals, the names, all stripped away. Just scared kids now, with real consequences. And soon the world would know their names, because what happened in that small Florida town was about to become national news. I'm Chapter 8. The monster in the headlines. The media loves a monster, especially when the monster is young, especially when they wear black eyeliner, talk about drinking blood, and call themselves a vampire. It's the kind of story that practically writes itself. Rod Ferrell didn't just commit murder. He gave the press a headline they couldn't resist. Vampire cult leader slays Florida couple. It was theatrical, dramatic, dark, and horrifyingly real. Within days, the story was everywhere. National news, TV specials, tabloids. Everyone wanted to know, who was this boy? Why did he kill? And what the hell was this vampire clan? Rod leaned into it. In jail, he gave interviews, lots of them, and each time it felt like he was still playing a character. He talked about being framed by a rival vampire gang, said he had multiple personalities. He stuck out his tongue in court photos, made sarcastic comments like, "God bless America." It was all just a performance to him, a final act. And honestly, I don't think he fully grasped the weight of what he'd done. Or maybe he did, and the performance was a way to detach, a shield, something to keep the guilt from sinking in. But the truth doesn't care about the show. The evidence was clear, the confessions were on record, and two people, Heather's parents, were still dead. As Rod's trial approached, it became obvious that this case wasn't just about murder anymore. It was about mental illness, trauma influence, and whether a 17-year-old should be held to the same standards as an adult. His defense team tried to argue that Rod was insane, that he was suffering from extreme emotional disturbance, that he didn't fully understand the consequences of his actions because of his upbringing, his drug use, and his obsession with vampirism. And to be honest, they weren't completely wrong. Psychologists who evaluated him found a long list of mental health issues: borderline personality disorder, psychotic tendencies, and deep-rooted trauma linked to years of sexual abuse and neglect. The testimony from family members only made it worse. Rod's aunt even came forward and confirmed that both she and Rod's mother had been abused by the same man, Rod's grandfather. It painted a picture, a heartbreaking one. But the prosecution pushed back. They said Rod knew exactly what he was doing. He had planned the trip. He brought weapons. He led the others. He made the choice to kill twice, and he marked the body with a symbol. That wasn't the act of a confused child. That was the act of someone who wanted to be remembered. And so the question became, what do you do with someone like Rod Ferrell? Do you execute him, or do you lock him away for the rest of his life? It's a hard question, and I'll be honest, I still don't know the answer, because Rod wasn't born evil. He was broken, over and over again, until there wasn't much of a person left, just a story, one soaked in blood and fantasy. But that's the thing about stories. Eventually, they come to an end. Chapter 9. Sentenced by the real-world trials. Don't bring closure. People like to believe they do that. Once the verdict is read and the sentence handed down, everything is neatly wrapped up. But when something this dark, this personal, and this senseless happens, there's no real justice. Just aftermath. Rod Ferrell's trial ended in February 1998. He was 17. He pled guilty to 2 counts of murder, armed robbery, and burglary. No surprise there, the evidence was overwhelming, and he had confessed more than once with a disturbing lack of remorse. But what shocked people was the penalty. The jury sentenced him to death. Rod Ferrell became the youngest person in the United States on death row at the time. 17 years old. A self-proclaimed vampire now facing execution by electric chair. And here's the thing, Rod said, that was what he wanted. In an interview later, he said he used to fantasize about dying in the electric chair, that it felt like a fitting end to the story he'd written for himself, like it was poetic in his mind, which is terrifying in itself, but the sentence didn't stick. 2 years later, in 2000, the Florida Supreme Court overturned his death sentence. They ruled that executing someone who was under 18 at the time of their crime was unconstitutional. Rod's sentence was reduced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. And he was angry about that. Not relieved, not thankful. Angry. Because in his twisted worldview, death gave him power. Immortality even. Life behind bars. That was just boring. But Rod wasn't the only one who had to face consequences. Howard Anderson, the boy who stood beside Rod that night, who claimed he didn't kill, but admitted to planning, was also sentenced to life in prison. He was 16 at the time. And like Rod, his past was filled with pain, neglect, and abuse. He had followed Rod like a shadow, hoping for belonging. Instead, he found himself locked away for life. Heather Wendorf, whose parents were brutally murdered, was never charged. The state determined she wasn't involved in the killings and had no knowledge of what Rod was planning. She testified against him, she cooperated fully, and she walked free. Still, the court of public opinion wasn't as forgiving. People questioned her role for years. Some still do. And maybe that's the cruelest part of all. She lost her parents and then had to live under the weight of everyone's suspicion. For the rest of her life, Heather would be known not just as a survivor, but as the girl who loved a vampire. Charity Kesey, Rod's girlfriend, wasn't so lucky. She was convicted of third-degree murder, armed robbery, and burglary. She served 8 years and was released in 2006. Dana Cooper, the oldest of the group, got 17.5 years. She served 13. She was released in 2011. They were all just kids when this happened. Kids playing dress-up in a fantasy that got out of control. Kids who thought they were powerful, untouchable, different. But the real world has a way of waking you up brutally. And the people left behind, the ones who had to pick up the pieces, Heather's younger sister who found their parents' bodies, the grandparents, the families of the other teens, the community of Eustis, Florida, the town of Murray, Kentucky. They all carried scars that didn't make headlines. Rod's mother, Sandra, testified during the trial, too. And if I'm honest, her testimony was all over the place. One moment she denied any connection to vampirism, the next, she was turning to reporters and saying, "I'm a vampire and I'll live forever." She was angry. Not just at what happened, but at the way she was being portrayed. She blamed Heather. She blamed the media. She blamed the psychologists. She said her son didn't deserve the death penalty, and that Heather should have been charged with murder, too. Maybe that was her guilt talking. Or maybe it was just denial. Either way, nothing she said could undo what Rod had done. By the time the trial ended, the vampire clan was no longer a myth. They were just a collection of broken teenagers scattered across prison cells, courtrooms, and halfway houses trying to make sense of the destruction they left behind. And if there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that delusions can be contagious. Pain can masquerade as power. And if no one steps in to break the cycle, it repeats itself. Again and again. Chapter 10. After the blood dries. Time moves on, even after tragedy. Even after headlines fade and names stop trending and reporters pack up and leave town. The world keeps spinning quietly and differently. But for the people who lived through it, time doesn't heal. Not fully. It just builds distance between the moment your world shattered and the moment you realize it's never going to be whole again. After the murders, after the trial, after the sentencing, the Rod Ferrell case didn't disappear. It became something else. It became myth. There were books, documentaries, a made-for-TV movie called Vampire Clan. Songs were written, lyrics referencing the blood spilled in Eustis, Florida. People were fascinated, obsessed even. Because this story had all the ingredients: teenagers, violence, the occult role-playing games, blood-drinking rituals. It was part horror film, part cautionary tale, but it was also real. And I think we forget that sometimes. We forget that two people were brutally murdered in their own home, that a teenage girl found their bodies, that a quiet town became a crime scene overnight, and that behind all the vampire lore and the media frenzy, there were families, real families, left to pick up the pieces. Rod's mother, Sandra, tried to reinvent herself. She moved, started a jewelry business, tried to distance herself from the trial. But the past doesn't let go that easily. The neighborhood she moved into even started a petition to have her kicked out. She said she just wanted a fresh start. But how do you start over when your name is tied to something like this? She later claimed she was cured, no longer mentally ill, no longer involved in vampirism. But when you dig into the interviews, you still hear that hint of denial, that bitterness, that refusal to take responsibility for how her own pain passed down into her sons. And Rod, he's still in prison. He's been behind bars now for over 25 years. For a long time, he was the poster child for teen violence and delusion-fueled murder. But in recent years, things have shifted. In 2012, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that mandatory life sentences without the possibility of parole for juveniles were unconstitutional. That decision opened a door, one that Rod and Howard Anderson both walked through. They appealed for resentencing. Howard was successful. In 2018, his sentence was reduced to 40 years, with time served counted toward it. He could be released as early as 2031. Rod's hearing came later, delayed because of the pandemic, but eventually in 2020 he got his chance. He stood before a judge and gave a statement. He said he was sorry, that he thought about that night every single day, that he wished he could take it back. It was a rare moment of clarity, of accountability. And for a second you wonder, was that Rod speaking, or Vesago? Or maybe just a man who'd spent most of his life behind bars trying to make peace with something you can never truly make peace with. But the judge wasn't moved. Rod's original sentence, life without parole, was upheld. And honestly, I think that's the right call. Because even if he's changed, even if time and age and guilt have reshaped him, the fact remains two people are dead. And no amount of apologies or legal arguments or courtroom tears can bring them back. The house where it happened is long gone now. The family moved, the furniture replaced, the blood cleaned up. But the story, the damage that lingers, in communities, in memories, in culture, because the Rod Ferrell case didn't just shock people, it became a symbol of what happens when trauma goes unchecked, when fantasy is mistaken for identity, when no one steps in soon enough. And I guess that's what stays with me the most. This wasn't just about vampires. It wasn't about games or rituals or gothic aesthetics. It was about pain, passed from parent to child, friend to friend, until it exploded into something irreversible. And in the end, the only thing left to do is ask the question we never want to face. What could have saved them? What could have stopped it? And who's going to notice the next lost kid before they write their own bloody story? Chapter 11. Echoes that never fade. I've told this story now beginning to end, and I still find myself sitting with more questions than answers. Not about what happened. We know what happened. The timeline is clear, the evidence is overwhelming, and the consequences were real. But what I keep turning over in my head is why. Not the surface level why, but the deeper, darker one. Why does someone like Rod Ferrell happen? Because at the heart of this case, underneath all the theatrics, the vampire obsession, the blood and ritual, was just a boy. A boy born into pain. A boy passed from one broken adult to another, raised in trauma, ignored, left to spiral. And then one day he picked up a crowbar and crossed a line he could never come back from. That line was never far away, and that terrifies me. Because we want to believe that killers come from nowhere, that they snap, that they're evil. It's cleaner that way, easier. But the truth is far messier. The truth is, we see people like Rod all the time, quietly slipping through the cracks, burying their pain in fantasy, begging for someone to tell them they matter before it's too late. Sometimes no one does. And that doesn't excuse what he did. It never could. 2 innocent people were murdered. A family was destroyed. A community will never be the same. And for that, Rod will spend the rest of his life behind bars, as he should. But it's worth asking ourselves the harder question. What would have happened if someone had helped him sooner, if someone had taken the abuse seriously, if someone had treated the trauma instead of feeding it, if the adults around him had been less broken, less self-involved, less willing to call a dangerous fantasy just a phase? What then? I don't know. No one does. But I do know this: real monsters don't wear fangs or cloaks. They don't need to drink blood or perform rituals under moonlight. Most of the time, they're just kids who were never protected, kids who were never told they were worthy of love, of safety, of a future. And sometimes they become the thing they feared most. Sometimes they become the thing no one stopped. This story may be over. The court case is closed. The names are no longer in the headlines, but the echo it leaves behind, that's the part we still live with. Thanks for listening to this one. I know it was heavy, but sometimes the heavy ones are the ones we need to sit with the most. Take care of yourself, and if you ever see someone lost in their own darkness, reach for them. Speak, ask, interrupt the silence. You never know whose story you might change just by being there. Thank you for staying with me through this one. At True Crime Echoes, we don't just tell stories to shock, we tell them to remember, to reflect, to ask the questions that don't have easy answers. Because sometimes the scariest part of a true crime story isn't the violence, it's how human it really is. If this story made you think, feel something, or see things differently, consider sharing it. Leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think could have stopped this? Or was it always inevitable? Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, so you never miss a story that still echoes. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and take care of one another.